So the next talk's going to be starting now with Aaron and Christian, and I'll let them take it from here and tell us about some wormholes.
Cool, hello. I'm Aaron Shelmire and
Christian Roylo.
Cool, and we both work at Secureworks. We both work in the counter threat unit, which is notionally the threat research team, but also threat operations, I'd say. Christian works on the special ops team, and I work in the cyber intel center. Typically, what that really means for me is most of the time I spend looking at malware or specific threat actors and threat groups. But over the past year, there's been a lot of our time that's been spent working on a few internet scale worms, which has been really an odd occurrence in the past 10 years. It really sort of all started with this. In April of 2017, a group of online activists or personas of sorts released a whole bunch of tools that were notionally based from the NSA. In that set of tools, there were a handful of exploits which were wormable. Most of these were based off of SMB exploits and vulnerabilities. All of those were the eternal-based tools. But there were also some exploits and vulnerabilities and tool sets in there that were wormable, which were not based off of SMB, but for some reason they weren't really picked up on. So those were released in April 2017, and Microsoft had previously released patches back in March 2017. So everybody patched, right? Like, we learned these lessons 10 years ago, first with, well, most recently with Configure, but previous to that with quite a few other worms that spread incredibly quickly across the internet. Well, in May 2017, we found out that, nope, a lot of people really didn't patch. And there was this worm which started spreading, and it was called WannaCry, and it compromised a lot of hosts and got a lot of press play, at least that we saw in the media, which meant that I worked all weekend long. And that, what really kind of caught people's minds and really spread through the zeitgeist was the fact that these were based off of, and this tool was spreading based off of an exploit in the Shadow Broker's release, which had been released a month earlier. So when we started to really dig into this story, though, we found that that really wasn't what had happened. There was a previous version of this worm which had started spreading in April 2017, and it had actually the version number 1.0 in it. That worm only used stored credentials and a list of credentials that were stored in the binary itself that it was trying against different open SMB servers. If we took a step back a little further, we found a previous version of the backdoor, which was called WCry Beta, WannaCry Beta. That version really didn't spread well at all. And it looked like they were trying to spread it manually and via spear phishes and so forth like that. But taking a look at the source code brought us back to a whole set of other SMB-based tools which had a North Korean nexus. In the same time frame, there was a much more targeted compromise which used the same basic SMB worm technology and functions, but it dropped two backdoor tools called Alpha NC and Bravo NC at that organization. And really, that SMB worm was based off of this tool suite named Bramble, which the North Koreans had been using since May 2015. When we took a look at our data, we were able to find that these worms had been trying to be, they were trying to spread these worms from way back in 2016 at least. And nobody paid attention to it at all until it started to compromise people's sales kiosks. But you know, there was a lot of media impact from this. There was a lot of questions about this. But when we actually took our step back and looked at the organizations that we were managing their security for, we had 73 unique clients who had actual detections of this worm in their environment. And that's out of a bit over 4,000 different clients that we manage security for. We had 399 total tickets in those 73 clients, and we had 278 unique clients who requested information from us. So the actual number of clients that were asking us information was much larger than the number of clients who were actually impacted. When we really dug into it, we also found that none of our clients had a true major impact. None of their core resources or core information technology infrastructure was really impacted. Everything that was impacted were things like a computer over at a sales office, and somehow they had a single internet access point that was completely open to the net. Things like that. And then that's also why you saw a lot of ATM machines and display kiosks that were being compromised. These were all hosts that had almost no, let's say, core business impact inside an organization. But we had a lot of hype around WannaCry and a lot of hype around these SMB vulnerabilities that were out there. So everyone's patched, right? A month later, this happened. And we found out, or it started to look like nobody had applied these patches, or a lot of really large organizations had not applied these patches. So on June 28, 2017, around 10 a.m. UTC, we started to receive requests from a few organizations, first based in Europe and then later based in the US, where they had massive amounts of their systems compromised. And I'll let Christian take it from here.
Okay, thank you. So both of us have been involved in a handful of NotPetya investigations. And of those, a lot of our clients were completely hosed. I thought it was important for us to bring you stories about this. Stories from the incident response, stories to how it happened, how it could have been prevented. But in order to do that, I need to protect the names of the innocent. We can't obviously give client data. So I've created a fictitious company to protect the identities of these other organizations. But this fictitious company, everything that I give in these stories actually happened. These are actual facts. They're not sensationalized. These actually happened. So the company that I'm presenting, that I created, let's just call it a beachwear clothing manufacturer and retailer. So presenting Seasides. That's Seasides as in the sea. You kind of have to question the credibility of a company based out of Pittsburgh that has a sun in their logo. So Seasides, they have about roughly 1,000 hosts, or window shop, so they lost most of their hosts. They had already engaged a third party to start manually rebuilding these hosts, so it's a long, laborious process. They called us in to help them out to determine, well, what actually happened? How did we get impacted? How do we prevent this from happening in the future? So our first goals was, well, let's work backwards. Let's find the earliest evidence of compromise, because that's important, because obviously they'll need to fix that. Determine the entry point to the environment, and then determine how it was spread within the environment, because fixing the introduction, patient zero is one thing, preventing something from spreading is another that the client needs to take care of. So my initial thoughts was, MS17010, Eternal Blue, because the news had come out that NotPetya uses this vulnerability. So I asked the client, hey, are you guys patched for Eternal Blue? And said, no, we patched. It's not Eternal Blue. So I'm like, okay, we're gonna have to dig further and investigate. So starting point, like I said, the client's a window shop. They were hosed. So things as an investigator, an incident responder that I am used to getting didn't exist. Domain controllers hosed, no domain controller logs. Their SIM was a Windows SIM. Their SIM hosed, no data from their SIM. And by now, the media has already reported on a few handful of companies that were completely, and some of these were very large companies, that NotPetya affected their entire operations. They were down. And so I took this list and I provided it to the client. And the client looked at the list and said, that one is one of our vendors. And of course, that got me thinking, okay, back in my mind, I need to consider that. The burden of proof is still very low, so I can't say, yep, this is what caused it, but this is something that I need to focus on. So where do we start? Well, fortunately, we did have some logs. Their firewalls obviously weren't Windows boxes, and so we pulled firewall logs and started analyzing those, working our way backwards to the initial time of the infection. And the logs, as we figured out, showed a lot of SMB traffic indicative of NotPetya. Great. It just proves that, or it just further supports that, yes, it is NotPetya. You got the splash screen, you got the logs, we know that. So it didn't really give us much more information. One of the problems was visibility limitations. Their firewalls were placed only on certain locations through outgoing, ingressing through outside the network, VPNs. They've had a ton of 24/7 VPNs to their third-party, trusted third parties. So it helped us a little, but it didn't really give us the answers we need. So the next step, well, we're going to have to go to where the data we need and get it from there, which means we're going to have to rebuild and conduct forensics on things we think will contain this data, things of evidentiary value. So we determined we got an AV server, let's do that. Let's rebuild the AV server. You got a SIM, let's rebuild the SIM. And possibly any early affected computers from the firewall logs. So we started doing this. So those of you not familiar with NotPetya does to a computer, it literally rewrites the MBR, the master boot record. So when it boots up, it shows that splash screen like, hey, you've been owned, send money to blah, blah, blah. But it also tries to encrypt the first n amount bytes of your MFT or your master file table, which is your table of contents to the drive. Without that, you can't actually rebuild and figure out where your files are. That's all gone. You need to basically carve data. It's a forensic technique where we have to carve data in free or unallocated space, whatever you call that. But it's worth a try for us to recover the data because the keys were in this data. So first thing we said is we'll rebuild the AV server. It's very easy. It's one workstation, one drive. And there's a tool we use to replace the MBR. And fortunately, the MFT was untouched by NotPetya. I don't know why, but through that, the forensic software was able to rebuild the structure of the drive, and then we were able to pull off AV logs. However, the AV logs was not of real benefit because AV didn't catch NotPetya, it didn't stop it, so there were no logs. At that time, there was no signature to stop the NotPetya outbreak. So AV logs, nah, didn't do any good. However, the security event logs on that host was very fruitful. What you see up there, make sure I press the laser pointer, is a snippet, all made up, by the way. Names, domains, made up. Everything else, factual. Names, domains, and target servers. Was a pattern we saw of authentications. These were 552 event IDs. So for you event ID gurus, you're probably thinking, what's 552? 552 is a explicit login. Trying to log on to another resource using different credentials than what you're logged onto that box. It's like, but isn't that 4648 or something? It is for machines that are greater than Windows XP and 2008 RC1. And you're like, wait a minute, so that means this is a Windows XP RC1 box. Yes, one of those. That's an important point that I'm going to cover in a few other slides. But basically, this is logs indicative of NotPetya trying to authenticate out to the rest of the environment from the AV log. This is important data. So I pulled this data, and I mapped it like this. And there were some interesting patterns I saw. The domains, the domain names, and the accounts. So one of the first things is I showed to our client, do you recognize these domain names? And the ones on the bottom, yes, that's our domain, etnet. Do you recognize any of the names up top? I don't recognize the domains, but Entropy, that's a company that is our vendor. That's the one that was in the news that got impacted by NotPetya. Whoa, we got more data, and we're like, okay, this makes sense now. We now have a higher burden of evidence that we know where NotPetya came from. Perhaps we can dig and find more. Then it hit me. It's like, hey, this is interesting. You see a pattern of where this moved through. We did some research on some of the domains. Like there's a domain called EMS. You found out that it was actually a division of Entropy, or Entropy Tech, called Enterprise Marketing Statistics. And that's the other thing I didn't say, is the client said, yeah, Entropy is a trusted vendor. We have a full-time connected VPN to their systems. They provide a service. They do statistical marketing, and we use their product. And of course, it all makes sense now, right? EMS is actually a subdivision. I looked it up on the webs, called Enterprise Marketing Statistics. eStats is the actual name of the application that Seasides uses, okay? So you can see kind of like a pattern of movement. So I contacted Aaron and basically said,
and if you look in this slide, you can see the same set of usernames being repeated over and over and over again in that same path.
So you looked at that, and that's kind of key to determining the path of the malware. We call it a flight recorder. Aaron looked at the malware and basically validated that, yes, the malware passes on credentials that it captures first in, first out. So you could use that order and basically build the flight of NotPetya, determining where it initially came from, which is kind of cool because you have not just patient 0 in your own environment, but patient 0 for that chain of the outbreak. Other interesting things was these names of the users, searched it on the web and found their LinkedIn accounts and said, they work for Entropy Tech and I do blah. There's also regional, looking at some of the names. So Oksana, you Google that, the first thing that comes up, it's a Ukrainian name. We didn't talk about, and I'm sure you guys know, the whole history about, and I don't know if that's something we probably should cover, but the whole history of the NotPetya, what has been reported in the news and I guess validated, was originated out of the Ukraine, possibly Russian government interference, meddling in Ukraine. It was related to the MEDocs software, which is a tax software that is very commonly used in the Ukraine. It was backdoored. And Aaron's going to cover that more in depth, so I don't want to really steal his thunder. But looking at the pattern, that first username is Ukrainian, so it may be a Ukrainian user, I don't know. The other usernames were all South Asian. So it makes sense regionally how maybe this malware moved. I'm starting to build this picture. But we know now, Entropy Tech is patient 0 for our client. So next step, we're going to rebuild the SIM. That was a little challenging because it was a RAID, like a 12-drive RAID 5. And from forensics, we don't want to muck around with the drives unless we have a backup. So we had to forensically image the drive to make sure we had a good drive, and then we can play around and rebuild the MBR. We were able to rebuild the MBR. MFT did exist, so we could power up. Took a little work, talked to the vendor to get their SIM software back up and running. But then we could do queries on the SIM. And we then identified the actual authentication into the application, we call it the eStats application, the first authentication into the environment. So now we have the server of patient 0 within Seasides and the authentication. We then did forensics on that box. So it's to rebuild the MBR, but the MFT was encrypted, so we had to carve out event logs. And then we found the first successful malware authentication via PSExec. So the SIM basically had domain controller logs, not as lofty, not as detailed. So we decided to do forensics to get more information. So I'm going to do a very quick, nice little graphics, play-by-play of what happened. So as you can see here, on the left, this is the Entropy Tech environment. There was a 24/7 trusted VPN into Seasides. Seasides had a separate domain for the eStats application called ETNet. When I looked in the firewall logs, the interesting thing is I did not find any SMB port 139 or port 45 traffic connections immediately preceding the propagation. And I'm thinking that doesn't make sense because, you know, the malware traversed from Entropy Tech, I should see a record of that in the firewall. So that got me wondering. But I did see a day prior, there was a port 445 session initiated a day earlier. So, this possibly could be involved. I don't know yet. What I then saw is the actual propagation of the malware into the eStats applications. Interesting enough, it only successfully authenticated and ran on one server.
At first.
At first, exactly. The remaining servers within this application domain, it tried to run with credentials, but it failed because it would only use credentials it knew from Entropy Tech. It didn't know any seaside credentials. So when you combine that with the fact that there was an active session, and we validated eventually through the analysis of the malware that NotPetya utilizes and abuses active sessions, right? So it doesn't need to actually have a credential. If you have an active session between two trusted environments, NotPetya will be able to use that to spread. So, that's really interesting and really cool, or not cool, depending on what side you're on. Then from the host that it initially compromised, it successively compromised other environments within the eStats environment with a different credential. So now it makes sense. The reason why it was a different credential is if you use an active session, it didn't actually capture the credentials on the Entropy Tech side. So for the most part, WDigest, which is a clear text caching of credential, has a clear text caching ability to text. Sorry. WDigest caches clear text passwords. That was likely turned off on the Entropy Tech side. But because of that active session, it was able to then infect this box, our client environment, because it was an older version. It was 2008, not RC1, or I'm sorry, 2003. There was no patch to turn off the caching of clear text passwords. So NotPetya was able to get an actual Seaside's credential, the actual password, and use to spread internally. So you're thinking, okay, well, this is within a separate domain. It should be contained. And with proper security segmentations, yes, it should be contained within only the eStats application. However, what happened was there was a successful, NotPetya was successfully able from one of the boxes to move to the rest of the environment, and within seconds basically own their entire network, thousands of hosts. So how did that happen? We found that the domain admin had logged onto one of the boxes, now domain admin for the entire environment, logged onto one of the boxes in the eStats application. Because WDigest, clear text password caching, was enabled, NotPetya was able to capture the domain admin's credentials and spread across their entire environment. This is an issue of domain trust and a poor implementation of domain trust within security. So we know now we know patient zero, we know how the malware spread. We know a lot about the misconfigurations of security for this client that we can report to them. But an interesting tidbit is like, well, who's this person? Who's Oksana B? And did a little web search, and we found that there was a freelance site of freelance site for people who want to go look for freelancers, coders, they're doing different things. There was actually a profile called Oksana B of someone in the Ukraine who did very, very niche work that was so related to type of work. There we go. Such niche work that was related to Entropy Tech's type of work. Now, obviously, this is just loose information. It's just a hunch. But it makes sense when you look at the path of the malware. And think about the story is, well, it started in the Ukraine. Again, this is not actual. This is more of a just thinking and a hunch, but it follows a story. Entropy Tech hires contractors, hired one in Ukraine, MEDoc software installed on their box, connected with an Entropy Tech environment, and it spread from there. It slowly worked its way getting Entropy Tech employees' credentials, slowly working its way out until it got to the eStat application. And from there, it moved over to our client. It's pretty tricky how this thing moved, but you think about it, like, there weren't a lot of businesses that completely got hosed by NotPetya. It's not like, you're hearing like, there's a good handful. But maybe that's because it requires all these gates and steps to occur, right? This is pretty complex to happen. But all these conditions existed in order for the NotPetya to affect our client.
Cool. So taking some of the good lessons in Christian's story there, really that you should really take home from you is really to like evaluate both the network segmentation pieces, but also the trust relationships you have with those external parties. Frequently, those can be abused in ways that you can't really war game or envision when you're first setting those up. The other takeaway there was in a lot of the organizations where we saw that NotPetya had catastrophically taken them down, that happened within 50 minutes in one place. It was pretty quick. In other places, it was within an hour as well. It was. It's something that I don't think anyone has been looking at or building their defenses for until this past year. But when we took a look at NotPetya itself, what we really found out was that payload, the way that it was pulled down was through a Trojanized application on the MEDocs statistics software and tax submission software. That update was truly pushed on June 22nd. So what a lot of organizations had done was they pulled down that software, tested that software, made sure that it didn't cause any problems with their implementation, and they didn't see anything wrong with it. But then the actual malicious payload was pushed 6 days later, again on a Friday, luckily, which caused me to have to work all weekend again. So before that, they had pushed previous implementations of this backdoor within that Trojanized software, first on May 15th and previously on April 14th. But one of the biggest stories with this was afterwards, there was a lot of marketing and a lot of press about another worm called BadRabbit. But BadRabbit really almost didn't impact any of our clients at all. What we saw there was that tool had 3 components. One of them was the disk encryption component. Another one was really just there to shut down and restart the hosts. And then the third part was a worm component, but it uses hard-coded credentials for the IPC dollar share in SMB. The big difference with this backdoor versus the other backdoor and the other worm, and the reason why this didn't seem to spread quite so quickly, was it didn't pass the credentials from host to host like NotPetya did on the command line when it propagated through an SMB, which meant that it didn't take credentials that were stolen from Christian's computer to my computer to the next computer and move forward through all of the hosts that it could touch, and those credentials could authenticate to. So those were the stories that got the most press this past year. But there were other worms that have been spreading and that have been being used, which really had a much larger impact within our organizations and the organizations that we monitor. The first one, and the one that we see almost every single day, is Emotet. Emotet's really just a piece of software that's there to load other software on your computer. It's really opportunistic cybercrime malware, but what we've been seeing is they've been deploying this SMB spreader module with it. And at first, it was just purely Mimikatz based, and that was first introduced back in July 2017. And then it started to get a little bit more press when in November 2017 they introduced a variant of it which also used the Eternal Romance exploit in it. The funny thing was, when they added that Eternal Romance exploit to the worm, they broke it. And it only worked and it only successfully propagated within the local host that it had already compromised. When it was trying to propagate to additional hosts, it actually didn't drop its payload and didn't successfully propagate. The other one that we've been seeing a lot of has been the TrickBot SMB spreader. And this first got a lot of press back in July 2017 as well. But at that point, all it was doing was trying to enumerate the credentials that it could see through SMB within your organization. But then at some point, and I'm not exactly sure when they introduced it, they also added Mimikatz and the ability to scrape credentials from plain text into that worm. those two worms, they've not been deploying ransomware. They've just been deploying themselves and other pieces of crimeware. But what's been interesting and what has been causing a lot of issues in organizations has been when those worms are spreading, they're spreading so quickly and overwhelming the domain controllers and the Active Directory systems within organizations that people are no longer able to authenticate to hosts, and it results in a denial of service situation within these organizations. And we've seen this in a lot of situations. So how can organizations mitigate against these situations? The first bit is, yes, you absolutely still need to patch.
So,
I'll just click.
yeah, we're not going to tell you anything here novel or new. It's all fundamentals, right? Basic security hygiene, repeated over and over and over. And as you can see in my example, if it was just basic security hygiene implemented, maybe just 1 or 2 gates would have been prevented, and this wouldn't have had a major impact to our client. So one of the things that I do and I work on is I do a lot of threat hunting. I've been doing it for the last 4 years for Secureworks. So I looked at a lot of environments, and there's almost a correlation between how ugly and bad and dirty your environment is and what's just basic stuff that that client has implemented. And when we do, after our threat hunting, we do our recommendations. The top recommendations are basic stuff that you've heard over the last 10 years. One of them, get updated operating systems, right? It's 2018, not 2008. You need to run supported operating systems. In the case of our client, if they had a supporting operating systems, they could have patched the WDigest clear text caching. Interesting enough, and this is, I'm sure you guys are aware of this, right? The point of contact for our client, the security guy was like, yeah, I've been trying to get these updated for a while, for years. However, there's backlash because this business area needs this software, and there's like, they don't make it anymore, or they don't want to buy the newest version, and they need it, and I've been told to keep it running. And I can't muck around with it. I don't even know, like, I have no idea what goes on there, but I got to keep it running. Well, this is what happens, right? Interesting, so Eternal Blue, history of that is Microsoft actually took a highly unusual step, in their own words, and created a patch for unsupported the Windows XP and 2003 server. So an ironic tidbit with C-Sides was, even though they patched for this, they were running Server 2000. I'm not kidding. They were running Server 2000, which there was no patch for. Those Server 2000s belonged to a specific application that they needed up and running because their one business needed it. Those got infected by NotPetya, but NotPetya was not able to replace the MBR or encrypt the MFT. So it's almost like saying security by obsolescent, which is not the story I want to tell. Sorry, it's not the message I want to say. It's just kind of ironic that that happened. Segmentation. So segmentation, we all know segmentation. Segmentation occurs on multiple levels. We're all familiar with network segmentations, firewalls, blah, 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 blah. And would that help here? Somewhat. I mean, it was a trusted VPN connector that had SMB traffic already open, right? So, that's network segmentation may have not worked properly there. For this case, the client had an open flat network, and there were other clients that shared the network, other organizations that shared that network that were also impacted. So segmentation definitely would have helped. But segmentation goes beyond network. Domain segmentation, segmenting your domains in Forest, and something called privileged access hardening, which Aaron is going to cover next.
Yeah, so what Christian was saying with segmentation is that in a lot of organizations, I think they think that once they implement a firewall and set up that sort of policy between different parts of the network, that their network has been segmented. And what we've been seeing time and again at the top of this large infographic of sorts is an attacker comes in, they just compromise a user workstation. From that user workstation, it's almost like clockwork. We always see this where they just use Mimikatz, they dump the clear text credentials from there, the hashes that they can get access to, and then they pass the hash from host to host to host. That allows them to access the domain controller eventually, because at some point, a domain admin has logged into one of those hosts that they compromise. They take that domain admin's credentials and they're able to use that to access every single host in the environment. We've seen it in these automated worms like NotPetya. We've also been seeing it in more targeted ransomware cases like the SamSam cases, which have taken down other entire networks and then been ransomed off. Microsoft has introduced a new set of technology, and I don't know how new this is anymore, but it came with Windows 10 in essence. And what that does is, and their recommendations are for you to use a privileged access workstation, and that's the little red computer up in the corner. And that privileged access workstation allows only that admin to create credentials on that host. And then if that admin needs to have can only have one laptop or one workstation, they have a virtual machine which they'll use for their actual user land life, to access their email, to go onto the web, to look at SharePoint or whatever. Now, taking an even larger step from that is to create this, and it's truly a 4-tiered set of credentials. But here, it only shows the first 3 tiers, which are based on your administrator credentials. At tier 0, your domain admin will only live within tier 0 and only authenticate in tier 0. That domain admin credential is not usable and not useful for accessing the next tier. Tier 1 is made up of your core workstations and your, what's the term I'm looking for? Your core workstations and your core servers that put business critical applications out there. And that's separate from your domain controllers and your Active Directory administration. So the credentials from tier 0, which are Active Directory administrator credentials, can't authenticate and can't administrate your business critical servers. The tier 1 credentials have to stay on tier 1. They only access and they only authenticate to your business critical servers. But then those credentials can't even access the workstations that your normal people are using, and that's what makes up tier 2. Tier 2 are your administrator credentials for your help desk and for your user workstation administrator staff. Those credentials stay there. Now, and then the 4th tier, which isn't shown in this image, is made up of your normal user credentials. Using this model, whenever an attacker compromises one of those workstations through a phishing email, which happens every day, everywhere, when they try to scrape those credentials from memory, they're no longer able to use those for anything other than accessing other people's workstations and other things on that tier, if you're able to keep these things clear and clean like that. So we strongly recommend that people move to this sort of model and that level of segmentation. In almost all of the cases where we've been seeing entire organizations compromised and put in terrible situations with ransomware, but then previously with a lot of the APT-style intrusions, it was because there was usually a single admin account which allowed you to authenticate and administrate all of the hosts. And it was that shared admin account which the help desk used, the server administrators used, as well as the domain administrators used. And they had a single password frequently, or a single set of credentials. So once you get that hash, just pass the hash across the organization. So in summary, the mitigations are patch. Absolutely put those patches into place. And this is pretty basic and pretty standard stuff. We're not selling any special things. But if you want to buy stuff, you can buy stuff from us too. But also segmentation, which is way more than just firewalls, and really includes your different separate Active Directory hosts. But creating that privileged access workstation and tiered model really helps organizations improve your security posture. Plus, disabling WMIC where possible. The W-Digest credentials and scraping those really is something that we see all the time. There are a lot of single sign-on applications which require W-Digest to be running and actually require people to use that. We understand that. Try to segment those organizations and those parts of your organization even more so than the rest of the organization. Yeah, and if not privileged access workstations, don't use a single account to administrate all of your hosts. That is our presentation. We've got 4 minutes, I think. According to that, but